Good evening, everyone. This week's parasha is Parashas Emor, Tavshin Pei Aleph. It's also Lag Baimer tonight, so happy Lag Baimer. I'd like to dedicate this week's Drasha in memory of my mother, Mrs. Shlomis Rabinowitz, Shlomis Bas Reb Yaakov Eliezer. And also today's learning has been sponsored by Rochelle and Britton Golder to commemorate the yard site of Rochelle's late husband, Ephraim ben Moshe Aryeh. In Parashas Emor, the last part of the Parsha is dedicated to the Yomim Tovim, to the holidays. And it's very interesting to note that when it comes to the holiday of Shavuos, which is the upcoming holiday, the Torah doesn't give a date for it. For Pesach, it tells us that it's in the first month, on the 15th day. It tells us that Sukkot is the 15th day of the 7th month. But there's no date that the Torah gives us for Shavuos. It tells us to calculate Shavuos because starting from the second day of Pesach, we bring a meal offering in the Beis HaMikdash called the Omer, and we start counting from that. And when we hit 50 days, that's when we celebrate Shavuos. But the Torah doesn't give a date. And it appears that what the Torah is doing is that the Torah is really stressing the fact that Shavuos is meant to be the culmination of Pesach, meaning Shavuos is connected to the counting of the Sfira, the counting of the days of the Omer, which connect back to Shavuos. Shavuos is meant to be the culmination, the completion of the process that starts from Pesach and that goes to Shavuos. Goes through the days of the Omer and then ends on Shavuos. And if you look in the Sefer HaChinuch, when he discusses the mitzvah of counting the Omer, he explains that the point of the mitzvah of counting the Omer is because when Hashem appeared to Moshe in the burning bush and told Moshe that he's going to take the Jewish people out of Egypt, he told them that when you get out of Egypt, you're going to worship on this mountain, which means Hashem told Moshe at the beginning that the Jewish people will leave Egypt in order to receive the Torah. The goal of leaving Egypt was, as a Sefer Chinuch, to receive the Torah. And therefore, we start from Pesach, we start counting the days that will get to the goal. When you anticipate a day, you count the days till you get there. So our counting of the Sfira, starting from Pesach, is that being that the goal of Pesach was to receive the Torah, we now count in anticipation of that day. And that day will be 50 days later. 50 days later is when the goal of Yetzias Mitzrayim is to be reached. That's what Hashem told Moshe. And the counting is meant to anticipate that special day. So the Torah mentions no date to Shavuos, just connects it to the Omer, which is connected to Pesach, to bring out this idea that Shavuos is meant to be the culmination. It's the goal of Pesach. There's a process that started with Pesach and it ends with Shavuos. And that process is that we left Egypt, we became free, and then we were able to receive the Torah. Now, if we say that the goal of leaving Egypt was to receive the Torah, then what that means is that when we left Egypt, we were free. But we didn't have an understanding yet of what does it mean to be free? What is the essence of who we are as free people? That was what the Torah was now. The Torah that would be given to us would now give us our purpose, our essence, our personality of what it means to be the nation of Hashem. But that Torah, very clearly, was existing before we became a people. That's what Hashem says. When you become free, you will worship me on this mountain. You will receive the Torah. So unlike other nations that form, they first come together and then they create their laws. The United States of America became the United States of America, and then their laws were created, or again, in the process of it, and then their laws were created. So that's how typically things work. Here, it didn't work that way. The laws that govern the people existed before the people, the nation that would be governed by those laws, came into existence. which actually means that the Torah preceding the creation of the Jewish nation really means to say that the plan for the Jewish nation is the Torah. If the Torah was the goal of the creation of the Jewish people that came about through leaving Egypt, and the Torah existed beforehand, then that's the plan. That's the plan for the Jewish people. So it precedes the Jewish people because it's the plan for the Jewish people. But we also know that the Torah was the plan for the whole world, for the creation of the world. There's a famous saying from the Zohar, Istakal baraisa ubara alma. Hashem looked into the Torah and created the world. The Medrash says it this way. Torah Omeres, Torah states, Ani yisi kli umnaseh shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I was the tool of Hashem. HaKadosh Baruch Hu mabit b'Torah. Hashem looked into the Torah and created the world. The Torah is the blueprint for the world. It's the plan for the world. It's what the world was created for. And it preceded the world. It preceded the world because the Torah wasn't a creation of man. It was a creation of God that preceded the world because it is the plan for the world. It is the blueprint for the world. And therefore it preceded the world. There is a very important ramification from this concept, from this idea. If we call the Torah the plan for the world, it preceded the world, then that means that if the Torah existed pre our existence, then that means that we should never think that we have the ability to completely comprehend what the Torah is saying. And this manifests itself very often what's called Tamei HaTorah, giving reasons, understanding the reasons of the Torah. The Sefer HaChinuch was a book written to give understanding, to give the reasons for the Torah. But the author of the Sefer HaChinuch writes that none of the reasons are definitive. They are a reason. They are actually meant to be a lesson for us. But they're never definitive because we can only understand things within the parameters of our human intellect. And as much as we have to use our human intellect to understand the Torah, that's all we can use. If we're merit, God expands our intellect in a way that can be beyond the human capacity. But we start, of course, with our human intellect. That's limited to what we can understand. It's limited within our human experience. But you can't limit the Torah to the human experience because the Torah precedes the human experience. It's the blueprint for the human experience. And therefore, and it's not meant to be the blueprint and therefore only limited to the human experience. Its preceding of the human experience means that it's beyond human experience. That is what our sages teach us. The fact that the Torah precedes the world, the Jewish people, it's the plan for us, is not just like, again, blueprints that a human being writes, and therefore it's limited. Therefore, the human intellect can completely understand it. No, it preceded the human experience, and now we get it, and we can, and it's related to human experience, but it's not. Its parameters are not human experience. Its parameters are an existence that preceded the world. Now we take our human experience to apply it to our lives, to try to understand it. When we talk about reasons for the Torah, again, it's not the definitive reason, but it's a way that helps us relate to it. It helps us relate. If we understand something, we relate to it better. If we understand something, we can now take it and apply it to our life, not just in practice, but in lessons, in a moral sense. If the Torah, when we say that the Torah has a reason, that's meant to be a lesson for us to apply to our lives. But it's never the definitive reason, because the Torah exists beyond our human intellect and capacity. And this is brought out in a fascinating way from the Rambam, from the writings of Maimonides. Because understandably, if we are to make sure that we internalize that the Torah is not limited to our intellect. Rather, we try to get some kind of understanding of the Torah with our human intellect. Then that means that our performance of mitzvahs is never, ever based on our understanding. Because even if we don't understand, that's our lacking. That's not any lacking from the Torah's point. And therefore, our performance of mitzvahs is never dependent on our understanding, which is really what chukim, the mitzvahs that we call chukim, are the mitzvahs that don't have a reason. We don't understand them. We do them anyway. And the Rambam brings this out in a fascinating way. There is a law called Me'ila. Me'ila, spelled Mem Ayin Yud Lamed Hey. We translate it as trespassing. But Me'ila means that if something has been sanctified to the Beis HaMikdash, you declare this article should be the property of the Holy Temple. It now becomes sanctified. It's the property of the Holy Temple, and it's sanctified, and you may not use it for your own mundane purposes. Now to use it. If you do use it, that's called Me'ila. That's called misusing, misappropriating the property of Hektish, which we translate Me'ila as a serious trespass, because again, it's the property of the Beis HaMikdash, and we're now using it for ourselves. If a person, and now regarding the details of the law of what happens to such a person, if he does it unintentionally, he has to bring a sacrifice. He has to pay a fine to the Beis HaMikdash for doing so. Okay, that's Me'ila. Now the Rambam in his Yad HaChazak and his Code of Jewish Law has a section even on parts of the Torah that are not practical nowadays. The laws of the Beis HaMikdash aren't practical, but the Rambam codified those laws. And he has a whole section called Hilchos Me'ila, the laws of Me'ila, the laws that apply to this idea of misusing something that was sanctified to the Beis HaMikdash. And the very last paragraph of this section reads like this: it is appropriate, it is fitting for a person to contemplate the laws of the Holy Torah and to try to understand them to their fullest according to one's ability. You've got to put in the most that you can to understand the Torah into the fullest sense. Now, if you find something that you cannot understand, you can't find a reason for it, you don't have an understanding for it, that should not become light in one's eyes. It should not become light in his eyes, and he should not act inappropriately towards it. And he shouldn't think about it like he thinks about other mundane matters. Meaning, another mundane matters doesn't make sense, you drop it. Not when it comes to the Torah. But, and the way the Rambam phrases it is, don't treat Torah as you would treat your regular mundane things. The Torah is holy. Come and see how stringent the Torah was when it comes to this law of Me'ila that we mentioned. If we take a look, you can take wood, you could take stones, you could take dirt. Once a person pronounces the name of the name, once the name of the master of the world is called upon it just with words, all you have to say is, this is Hektish. This belongs to the Holy Temple. Niskachu, they become sanctified. And if anybody treats them in a mundane manner, Ma'alba, he has committed mal. He has seriously trespassed. And even if we did it unintentionally, you need atonement. How much more so? When it comes to a mitzvah that God created for us. A person should never reject them because he doesn't understand the reason behind it. you should not reject it, and you should not look at it as you would look at a mundane, unholy matter. Harei nemar ba'Torah, the Torah states, "Ushmartem es kol chukaisai v'eschal mishpatai v'asisem oisam." You shall guard all my statutes and all my judgments and all my laws, and you shall do them. Amru chachamim, our sages say, what is the Torah here saying when it says, and you should guard my chukim, guard my statutes? Litein shmira v'asiyah lechukim k'mishpatim. That one should apply guarding and performance for chukim, for mitzvahs that we don't know the reason, as we do for mishpatim, for the mitzvahs that we do know their reason. V'asiyah yudua hi v'shiyasa chukim. Asiya, do them, means you perform them. What does it mean, guard my statutes? It means be careful with them. Never consider them less important than the mishpatim. The mishpatim, the judgments, the laws, are referred to mitzvahs that their reasoning is well understood. And their benefit for society, for the world, is well known. There are certain mitzvahs we understand why the Torah says don't steal and don't kill, honor your father and mother. Chukim, statutes, are the mitzvah that we don't understand the reasoning. Amru chakamim, our sages say, chukim, the word chukim chakti lacha, I created them, I kind of chiseled it out for you, and you cannot question them. Okay? A person's own kind of inside, he kind of questions, why am I doing this? Okay? And I'm going to skip a few lines here. Karbanis, the sacrifices that we spend so much time studying, the big portions of the Torah about karbanis. We're constantly praying for the sacrifices. It's all chukim. We have no understanding of how it works. And our sages say the world stands on the service of the sacrifices, which we don't understand why we're doing what we do. When you do both, the ones that you understand, when you don't understand, that is what brings a person to the life of the world to come. The Torah first talks about, the Torah first puts the commandment of keeping the chukim. You shall guard my statutes and my judgments. The first thing mentioned are the chukim, the ones that we don't understand. So the Rambam uses this law of Me'ilah to tell us how we have to approach the mitzvahs. If we have to consider something that we made holy just with our words, we cannot treat it in a mundane manner, we cannot treat it like we treat other things, how much more so a mitzvah that Hashem commanded, a mitzvah that Hashem created. How holy is it that we shouldn't treat it like we treat other things? And what does that mean? It means we don't question it. It doesn't mean we don't try to understand. And it doesn't mean that we don't have questions that are weighing on us, that we don't ask them. We can ask them. But we don't base our performance on what we understand or don't understand. We base our performance on the fact it's Hashem's mitzvah. And the fact that we're limited in our understanding doesn't therefore mean that we have a right to reject it. In worldly matters, if it doesn't make sense, doesn't make sense. Don't deal with it. Of course, you got to make sure that you really know it doesn't make sense. Sometimes you're just not knowledgeable enough to know. But again, if there's something that you're knowledgeable enough to know and it doesn't make sense, you drop it. That's not how it works with Torah. When it comes to Torah, we have to try to understand it as best as we can, according to what we're able to, and delve into it and work on it. But never to decide and never to question and never to doubt or never to look down upon something in the Torah that we do not understand, because the Torah preceded us. Our intellect is limited. We're human beings. The Torah preceded the world. It was a blueprint of the world. It's a plan for the world. And therefore, we should never think that with our seichel, that with our intellect, we can fully grasp or we can decide what's right or what's wrong, what makes sense, what doesn't make sense. Because when you do that, based on what the Rambam says, Rabbi Aaron Kotler said, you are in spirit doing Me'ilah. That means, because like the Rambam says, if the Rambam says that we have to treat the mitzvahs like we treat something that was sanctified, and based on what we see from Me'ilah, that we don't treat something sanctified in a mundane manner, a mitzvah we don't treat that way either. If we do treat a mitzvah that way, then we have trespassed, we have misused Hashem's holy object, which is a mitzvah. We're not going to bring a sacrifice for that. The Torah didn't tell about sacrifice for that. But in essence, in spirit, in meaning, we're doing the same thing. So therefore, our approach to mitzvahs always has to be one that, although it doesn't always make sense to us, the source for it is unquestionable. And therefore, we perform it. And sometimes that applies not only to the actual mitzvah, it applies to details of a mitzvah. Sometimes sometimes we have questions about rabbinic law. But rabbinic law, the power for the rabbis to make rabbinic law comes from the Torah. So the validation of it, the permission for it, I can't find the right word right now, but its existence comes from the Torah, like the mitzvahs the Torah says. So we should never be so quick to go in and jump and say, "Wow, this doesn't make so much sense," because again, sometimes we just don't know enough. But we could be very learned. We could be very smart. We can be very learned and very knowledgeable in Torah. But there are places in the Torah that we can, let's say, argue on an interpretation. Two rabbis can disagree on how to understand the words of the Torah. But no one is ever going to reject what the Torah says. No one's ever going to reject even what the rabbis have established because we don't understand it or because we don't appreciate it. And especially only because it may not fit into the way we see how life should be. The Torah precedes. It's the plan for the Jewish people. It's the plan for the world. It came before everything. And therefore, we cannot expect that we're going to have a full grasp of what it is. And therefore, if we don't understand, we never reject. We always respect. And actually, we see this from Akedas Yitzchak. When Hashem told Abraham to bind Yitzchak as a sacrifice, this idea is prominent in that episode. We always talk about how Avraham Avinu was ready to give up his one and only son for Hashem. But we also know that part of the problem was that Hashem contradicted himself, so to speak. First, he tells Abraham, through Yitzchak you will have seed. And then he tells Abraham, slaughter Yitzchak. It's a contradiction, an obvious contradiction. What's interesting is that the Medrash says is that after Hashem sent the angel to tell Abraham, stop, don't slaughter him. So the Medrash says that Abraham said to the Rebbeinu Shalom, I have a big question here. I've got to get this off my chest. And the way he says it is like this. I'm going to let you know what I have to say. Previously you said to me, through Yitzchak you'll have seed. And you seem to go back on that, to retract that. You change that. Then you say, take your son and bring him up, bring him up as a burnt offering. That's very important words to bear in mind here. Remember, the command of Hashem to Abram was, bring him up as a burnt offering. And now you say, stop. So Abram says, what's going on? HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, I never changed my words. I told you, ha'aleyu, bring him up as an olah. Okay, I told you to bring him up. That means you to bring him up. You have to bring him up to, and I told you where, to bring him as an olah. I never told you to slaughter him as an olah. I just said, bring him up as an olah. So you brought him up, and then I told you to take him down. So Abraham didn't originally seemingly understand the words, bring him up as a burnt offering, would normally be translated as offer him. Hashem said, I told you to bring him up. That's the wording. That's what I said. What I really meant was bring him up. But I never said you have to slaughter him. So therefore, I didn't change my words. So that means Abraham was asking Hashem. Now, again, Hashem already told Abraham, you don't slaughter your son. Right? So Abraham's questions are academic because he's not slaughtering his son anymore. That's what Hashem said. Stop. But Abraham says, but how am I to understand what's going on here? How am I to understand what you did? You're contradicting yourself. The Rebbeinu Shalom is his emes, his truth. How can we be contradicting? So the Rebbeinu Shalom answered this question. But the question is, why did Abraham Avinu wait to ask this question for then? Why did he only ask the question after Hashem told him don't do it? When Hashem first told him to do it, he should have said, Rebbeinu Shalom, what's going on? Does it mean that Abraham wouldn't have done it? But he would have wanted to understand. Is something wrong with that? So why didn't he ask it right away? The answer is that Avraham Avinu felt that if he's going to ask Hashem about how this makes sense, then that gives the impression, or could give the impression of questioning if this should be done. And Avraham Avinu would never allow that impression to be made. And therefore, he was given the mitzvah. There were contradictions. He had questions he couldn't understand. He couldn't make sense of it, but he did it anyway. And then afterwards, once he did it, he asked the question, and the Rebbe explained it to him. But Avraham Avinu already told us that Hashem's commandment is not dependent on whether we get it or not, whether we understand it or not, whether we appreciate it or not, whether it makes sense to us or not. By Avraham Avinu, it made absolutely no sense. It didn't matter. Hashem gave him a mitzvah. The word of Hashem is something that we live by and know that it's the best for us. Do we always understand it? No. Can we understand it? A lot of times not. Even the things that we do understand, that we think we understand, to a large degree, we don't understand. Because there are so many things that we study that we do understand, that we still have so many questions about, that in a large degree, we still don't understand it. Even the mishpatim that we do understand. There's so much of the mishpatim that we don't understand. It doesn't matter. Our performance, our listening, our living by the word of Hashem is not dependent on that. At the same time, it is important to understand the Torah. That is the mitzvah of learning Torah, to understand it, to delve into it, to go deep, to understand. It's meant we should be learning the reasons for mitzvahs that the commentaries give us, so that we relate to it better, and that we take lessons from it into our lives, practical lessons. These are all very important things that we should do. No one's saying not to do them, but the point is, they are never the basis for our performance. We can never decide that the Torah is going to be decided based on our intellectual capacity, because that can't happen. We can't fully fathom the Torah. We should never think we can fathom the Torah. To think that we can understand the Torah just based on our human intellect and therefore decide how to value the Torah, that's me'ilah. That's trespassing. That's misusing a holy object of Hashem. And therefore, we approach the Torah with the greatest reverence, because we understand it preceded us. It's the plan that we were created upon. And the Jewish people, when the Torah was given, expressed this when they said the famous words, Na'aseh v'nishma. We will do and we will hear. The order should be you first hear, you first know what you're doing, and then you do. Klal Yisrael, the Bnei Yisrael said, we will do and we will hear. That means we are ready to do even before we have heard. Now, you have to know what there is to do in order to do it. But what it means is that we're going to do it even before we fully understand. We'll still do it. Even if we haven't had a nishma, even if we haven't had an understanding of it, we haven't contemplated it. The word shema, like Shema Yisrael, doesn't just mean hear. It means to contemplate. It means to think. Na'aseh v'nishma, we're going to do even before we think it through, because we understand that the mitzvah is not dependent on our understanding. It precedes our understanding. And although we have to work to understand, our understanding is never the basis or the barometer in any way for our performance. That is what Jewish people said when they accepted the Torah. Nasa v'nishma. They followed the example of Avraham Avinu, that when it comes to the mitzvahs, we are not the ones who decide on the mitzvahs in any way. The mitzvahs are the holy words of Hashem. We treat them with the utmost holiness, which means we follow them even if we don't understand. And then we do our best to try to understand and delve and enjoy the depth and apply it to our lives. But the Torah is beyond and holy, and just too holy for us to treat it like some other matter that is limited by our understanding. Have a wonderful evening and a wonderful Shabbos.